Eternal darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel. Chapter 9, Aligning the Key to the Door. Alexandra Roivas watched as Richard Gale returned to the present and the secret room. When he was back, she saw that he staggered backwards. She was thankful when Yvette Gale ran over to his side and supported him. She knew that Richard must have taken a beating. After he looked like he had recovered from the time, she said, "What happened back there?" She watched as Richard looked at her and said, "A lot. Apparently the artifact of the one that Pius's ancient can defeat is still in the place that Pius and Karim found. He also found the second alignment rune. In fact, when he found the rune, he had also had a spell to recover health and sanity. Check to see if we have them here." She started to page through the book and eventually got to the spell section of the book. She found the recover spell and then looked at the two alignment runes they had. The first they had was a red one for Chiturga, and the second they had was a blue one for Ulioth. She then looked past the page and saw room for two more runes. She turned to Richard and said, "We have the blue and red one. Will those help?" She watched as Richard walked over to the book and said, "The red one will restore health. Do you mind if I try it for a second?" She nodded and watched as he held the book and started to cast the spell. However, just as he was about to finish the spell, she saw him explode. She screamed, and then saw Yvette run over and ask, "Alexandra, are you all right? What scared you?" She looked at Yvette in disbelief. Her husband exploded, and she seemed more concerned about something that scared her. She tried to gather her wits as she said, "Didn't you see what happened? Your husband just exploded. He was casting a spell and exploded." All that was happening was getting to be too much to believe. First her grandfather's death, then the discovery of the book, and now this. She almost jumped in fright when she heard a voice she didn't expect to hear say, "I exploded? I can't believe that. I feel entirely better. Not like I've been splattered all over this room." She started to worry if she was losing her grip on reality. She then heard Yvette say, "It must have been another mind game from Pius and his ancient. Maybe we are starting to appear powerful enough to stop him." She then wondered if Yvette was right. Maybe what she did need was a way to recover her sanity, so she could survive to the end of what was coming. She looked over at Yvette and said, "You may be right. The whole scene seems so real." She closed her eyes and then took a few deep breaths. Finally she opened them and said, "All right, what will be our next move?" She then heard Yvette say, "Well, I think we have everything we need to open the plaque lock. We have the sword and the rune to enchant it with." She then saw Richard nod and say, "That's it. Enchant the gladius with the Ulioth rune, and we'll head to the kitchen." She quickly cast the spell and watched as the gladius glowed a bright blue. When it was done, she led the way from the secret room to the kitchen. They were almost to the kitchen when she heard the phone ring. She stopped, wondering who it was calling them. She quickly walked over to the phone and picked it up, saying, "Hello?" She felt her body freeze when she heard the person on the other side answer. Yvette Cale stood by Alexandra when she picked up the phone. In fact, something told her that something was about to happen. It was then she heard the voice on the phone and swore her blood froze. She wasn't sure what Alexandra had heard, but she heard Pius saying, "Remember me, Alex." She then watched as Alexandra slammed the phone down, visibly shaken by the call. She then heard her husband walk over to Alexandra and asked, "Alexandra, who was on the phone?" She then heard what Alexandra said. "It was my grandfather. He asked if I remembered him. It's like he was calling from beyond the grave." Before she could say anything more, Yvette put her hand on Alexandra's shoulder and said, "It wasn't him. It was Pius. He's trying to stop you by messing with your mind. You need to be strong." She was startled when her husband said, "But I heard him, love. I heard Dr. Roivas's voice as well. Am I thinking that because my sanity is sapped as well?" She just nodded and heard him sigh. "Well, we need to get that last rune so we can all recover. Are we even sure the phone rang?" Yvette thought about it for a moment. She didn't even remember hearing the phone ring. She reached over and picked up the receiver and listened. She held it for a moment and then said, "The line is dead. It must be one of Pius's tricks." She put the phone down and said, "Maybe until you both get back to normal sanity, I should take the lead." She watched as both nodded and then heard Alexandra say, "Maybe we should get that door open in the kitchen." She nodded and led the way into the kitchen. When they were there, she watched as Alexandra approached the plaque and pushed the gladius into it. In a moment, she heard a click and saw the weapon come back out, and the metal disappeared. She watched as the door then opened and stood back, not knowing what would come out. Yvette then saw her husband look in the door and say, "I think we lucked out. Nothing but a stocked pantry. If the next chapter page is in here, we need to find it fast." She watched as he and Alexandra looked through all the cans and jars in the pantry. Soon she spied a jar full of a spice, but in with the spice was a paper. She picked up the jar and said, "I think I found the page." She handed it over to Alexandra, and just as she opened the jar, she felt dizzy. She blinked her eyes, and again she saw she was in the place where she had seen Pius speaking with his ancient before. This time she stayed in the shadows as Pius summoned the image of the ancient he had spoke with earlier. If Richard was right, it might not be the same that he saw Pius choose. But to her, Pius was speaking to Ulioth. As she listened, she heard Pius say, The pillar of flesh has been constructed. She wondered where this pillar was, and then listened again as he said, "The planets will soon be in alignment. The next millennia will be your time. Even now your guardians prepare the gate." At the mention of the gate, she started to wonder where this gate was, and gasped aloud. She realized where the gate was, and realized why Pius might have killed Dr. Roivas, and why he was striking at them. The gate must be on the grounds of the Roivas estate. She then noticed that Pius was looking in her direction, and she closed her eyes, hoping that when she reopened them, she would be back in the Roivas estate. Richard watched as his wife opened her eyes. He was sure that something happened. The second Alexandra had opened the jar, he saw Yvette stop moving, as if her mind was elsewhere. He looked at her and said, "What did you see this time?" He watched as she blinked her eyes and said, "I saw Pius talking with his ancient, Ulioth." He blinked, hearing the name, and wondered if the next time he experienced one of his blinks, if Pius's ancient would be Zelothoth. He then heard Yvette say, "Pius was talking about a gate. I think the gate is somewhere on the grounds of the estate." He was stunned at that news. He was almost distracted when he heard Alexandra gasp. He quickly turned to face her as she said, "This next chapter is about my ancestor, Maximillian." When he heard that, Richard started to wonder how long the Roivas family had been fighting Pius and his ancient. He then felt his eyes go wide as she said, "This is even set in the time he was in the house, in 1760 A.D. Richard struggled to get the right words together, remembering everything that had happened so far. He finally said, "Back in the time when America was the colonies." He watched as she nodded and said, "I think I saw his ghost walking the halls upstairs. This also might go with something Yvette just found out." He watched as Alexandra looked at him and said, "What did she find out?" He heard his wife respond to the question as she said, "There is a gate of some sorts on the grounds. I know we've looked around the entire mansion, except for a few places. But where could they hide a gate big enough for an ancient?" He started to think about that when Alexandra finally said, "Maybe it's not exactly on the grounds. Did you notice the grounds behind the building? They are very hilly. Maybe there is something underneath them. Maybe you'll find out what when we go into this chapter." Richard nodded and said, "You're right. Maybe in that chapter we can explore the basement. This gate may be located down there." He watched as everyone nodded, and they made their way back to the secret room. As they walked through the library, he almost did a double take as he saw a book fly across the room. He felt shaken by that sight, and then heard Yvette say, "Maybe after that chapter we can all take care of your dropping sanity." He nodded as they continued through the secret hall. When they finally entered the secret room, he watched as Alexandra put the page in the book and said, "All right, let's find out where this gate is. I hope you are ready to deal with this. This chapter is called The Lurking Horror. He nodded and said, I'd be more worried if it were in the year 1770 AD. At least, in that time, he'd be more tolerant of an Englishman. Mind you, the blue jeans might confuse him. He watched as his wife and Alexandra giggled at that. He then watched as Alexandra started to read the chapter. As she read, he saw everything starting to dissolve from sight, and he noticed that Yvette wasn't experiencing the same thing. Maybe Maximillian wasn't going to end up in the strange hall that the others had encountered.